All right, so today we're going to be going over inference questions, also known as text completion questions. So, in these questions, you're going to be given a nonfiction passage, which isn't quite finished. It's your job to pick the answer choice that best completes the paragraph. So, these passages are pretty much building up to like a conclusion or an argument that is really strongly hinted at, but it's just not explicitly stated. And the correct answer choice is usually just going to explicitly state like the conclusion, like, okay, what are you saying? And so pretty much you're kind of given the dots or kind of given the points. It's just kind of your job to connect them. And that's going to be how you're going to get your correct answer. So basically, you just have to finish the line of logic presented in the passage. So while you have to make a bit of like a logical jump, it really is just a tiny jump. So, some strategies are to identify like the claim or the theory that the answer choice should be directly supporting, right? Many wrong answers are going to seem sort of correct, like on topic, but they're not really supporting like the very explicit claim or theory that the rest of the sentences given to you are sort of pointing towards. So, usually you'll find this like claim or theory like in the sentence before the one with the blank, or sometimes even like in the same sentence. It's going to be right before the blank somewhere, but make sure you are reading the entire context given to you, because that's going to help you figure out what actually is the claim the author has. So, oftentimes the correct answer is just a restatement of like the main idea, or even like sometimes a sentence, like sometimes it'll just be like a reworded sentence that is already given to you in the context. So, don't pick answers that introduce a new idea. This kind of sounds similar to like main idea strategies, and it really is, because you really don't have to make a big jump from what is already given to you to finish up the passage. Now, many answers do sound right because like they are on topic and they match up maybe with the second part of the passage, but they don't match up with the first part. So, if you ignore the context given to you in the beginning and you're just kind of reading like the last sentence and then reading the inference with it, a lot of things are going to be sound correct because it seems like they're fitting in with the logic, but a lot of answer choices actually kind of stray away from the context given in the first part of the passage. These are what we call half right and half wrong answers, because usually they do make sense. Like if you think about it, like they could be true, but they're not relevant with the entire context. Some answer choices, if you're kind of having to think a lot about it, like, okay, technically, because they're saying this, technically this could be true, that's not the correct answer. You should not have to make that many connections on your own leading up to from the passage to the right answer. It should really be more obvious than that. So, which statement ties everything together and concludes the logic appropriately? So, it should just kind of be a neat tie up that goes in line with the logic. So, don't overthink these questions too much. All right, so let's read our first example. Microbes that live in shallow lakes and ponds produce methane, a harmful greenhouse gas. Ecologists blah 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 wanted to see how different types of shallow water plants might affect the amount of methane that escapes into the atmosphere. Okay, so just to summarize that, so these microbes live in water and they make methane, and then these people want to see how plants affect that amount of methane. Aubin's team set up some water tanks with soil and microbes from local ponds. Some tanks had a type of underwater plant that grows in the soil called water milfoil. Other tanks either had duckweed, a type of plant that floats on the water's surface, or algae. Aben and his team found that tanks with duckweed and algae released higher levels of methane than tanks with water milfoil did. This finding suggests that blank. Okay, so if I had to kind of rewrite the line of logic here, I would say microbes make greenhouse gases, or they make methane, sorry. And these researchers wanted to see how plants affected this amount. And then they did this experiment with different types of plants, and they found that this watermill foil stuff, the tank with the watermill foil released less methane than the duckweed and algae. And since this entire research was about to see how different types of plants affect the amount of methane, if I had to follow this logic, again, microbes made methane, they did an experiment, and the observation was that the tanks with water milfoil made the least methane, then I would say to complete that logic, I would just say water milfoil affects the microbes' production of methane in some way. Now you might be saying, yeah, well, duh, they already kind of said that in this last sentence, right? They found that duckweed and algae, the tanks with duckweed with algae released higher levels of methane than tanks with water milfoil did. Isn't that saying the same thing? Well, that's kind of the trick here. It is honestly that simple because technically here they're not saying directly that the water milfoil does something to it's not saying that the water milfoil affects the microbes which causes less methane. They're just saying the observation. The observation was the tanks with the specific plants release certain levels of methane. They're not explicitly saying that this type of plant affects methane production. So that's why I conclude the logic by explicitly saying what this entire passage is leading up to, what that observation means, right? It just means that water milfoil affects the microbes' production of methane in some way, or decreases the production in some way. So here, choice A fits the best, right? The presence of some kinds of underwater plants, like water milfoil, helps prevent methane from escaping shallow lakes and ponds. So yeah, this is kind of what we said. This water milfoil stuff and plants like it just kind of affect the process in some way, and less methane escapes these water bodies. And while this might seem sort of obvious, again, it's not as explicitly stated in the rest of it. It's very explicitly stated here that this plant is going to prevent methane, but it doesn't explicitly say that here. So that's how we complete the logic of this sort of thing. So let's see why the other answer choices are wrong. Shallow lakes and ponds release more methane than deeper bodies of water because shallow bodies of water usually have more plants than deep bodies of water do. Well, this passage has nothing to do with comparing deeper bodies and shallow bodies. We're just experimenting with different plants, not depths of water, so that really doesn't have anything to do with anything. Shallow lakes and ponds are more likely to contain algae than to contain either water milfoil or duckweed. Maybe, but we don't really know that. It doesn't really talk about if certain plants are more frequently seen in certain bodies of water. Also, that's not what this finding is suggesting. The direct inference you should be making is about the methane levels. How do they affect the methane levels? That's what this entire passage is all about, right? It's not about which plants show up more in different lakes or ponds. That's not relevant. Having a mix of algae, underwater plants, and floating plants is the best way to reduce the amount of methane in shallow lakes and ponds. Okay, well, this one does talk about methane and our plants, right? But here, this last sentence is pretty much explicitly comparing water milfoil against all of these. So our overall conclusion should be something that kind of emphasizes how water milfoil decreases methane, right? And also, this kind of seems wrong to me, if duckweed and algae release higher levels of methane, and it does say here that duckweed is a floating plant, I don't think that the floating plants or the algae should be in the mix at all. Maybe we should just have that water milfoil stuff. So I don't really see where they're getting this from. So that's why A is going to be the closest thing directly completing our logic, that because we observed that the tanks with the water milfoil released less methane, and our research is about which plants affect methane in what way, then this finding suggests that some underwater plants like water milfoil help prevent methane from escaping. Okay, so this one I think is a little more straightforward, but I still like this question. So, in their book Smart Pricing, these people consider musicians' use of the non traditional pay as you wish pricing model. This model generally offers listeners the choice to pay more or less than a suggested price for a song or album, or even to pay nothing at all. As the authors note, that's the option most listeners chose for an album by the band Harvey Danger. only about 1% opted to pay for the album, resulting in earnings below the band's expectations. But the author also discusses musician Jane Siberry, who saw significant earnings from her pay as you wish online music store as a result of many listeners choosing to pay more than the store's suggested prices. Hence, the pay as you model may blank. Okay, so basically, it talks about this model where, these musicians just kind of ask their fans to just pay whatever they want for their album, and they can even just pay nothing at all. And for this band, it looks like people chose to not pay anything because that was an option they had. But for this other musician, it turns out people were kind of nice and they paid even more than they had to, than the store suggested price. So very different sort of results, even though they seem to use kind of the same pay as you wish online model. So here, honestly, I can make almost like my own sort of main idea, right? If I had to make my own main idea, I'd be like, since it's just completely up to the buyers, the pay as you wish model sometimes works well and sometimes it fails, right? Here, it's just kind of explaining what it is, and then we see two very different situations for this model. So, just going along with this logic, because this is all we have, right? I would just say this model may have very variable results, which means like it can have any sort of results. It can be really bad, really good. I think that's what this passage is just trying to say. Like it's just sort of unpredictable. So, if I had to finish this logic, then I think the best answer choice, and you can pause to see which one is better, I think A is going to be the best one. So, this model may prove financially successful for some musicians, but disappointing for others. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it, right? It was pretty good for Jane, but it was pretty disappointing for Harvey Danger, like the band. So, again, it's simple, right? It's just like, you're like, yeah, it's not like a crazy inference, right? But it's just sort of restating what it already told us in just a more concise way. Just a restatement. Okay. So let's go over the other answer choices. So B, hold greater financial appeal for bands than for individual musicians. Well, this kind of disproves it, right? Because this band here clearly made a lot less than Jane, so it doesn't hold greater appeal for bands. Maybe even holds less. So this is just kind of disproved by the passage. C, because cause most musicians who use the model to lower the suggested prices of their songs and albums over time. Well, I'm going to think about this one for a second. So, basically it's saying if you're going to use the model, you're going to want to lower like your suggested price over time. However, again, this one might be true because maybe if I lower the suggested prices, people are going to be willing to pay the whole thing instead of paying nothing. If I make it really expensive, no one's going to really want to buy it, right? So maybe this is true. But see, I'm already making a lot of jumps to explain why C is true. That's already tells me like that this isn't a good answer. But if that isn't enough to convince you, this doesn't make sense for Jane because she's using this model and people are already paying more than the source suggested price. If I was Jane, I would actually honestly like make the price even higher to see if I can keep getting people to pay more money, because if they tend to pay higher than what I suggest, I'm going to suggest a really high number so they even want to pay even more than the high number that I suggest, right? So C doesn't really make sense for musicians like Jane who are already having a lot of profits based on this pay as you need model. So this may be true for the band, but you can see that I had to do a lot of thinking to get there. That's too much thinking, and it does not make sense for Jane, who's already doing so well. Why would she want to lower the store's suggested prices? D, more strongly reflect differences in certain musicians' popularity than traditional pricing models do. This one might be true because if people are more popular than others, maybe their fans are willing to pay that much, but maybe that's true. But do you see how there's a maybe in there? Because it's totally possible that this band is way more popular. It's just that the fans are just kind of cheap, right? And it's possible that Jane is not that popular. She has a small amount of listeners, but they're really nice listeners who are willing to pay her because she deserves the money for all the work she put in. So we don't know if Jane is more popular than Harvey Danger, or if Harvey Danger is more popular than Jane. We just know that maybe one's fans are a little more less willing to pay than others, but we don't actually know about their popularity. So this is introducing a different idea, and it's kind of a stretch. So that's why D is also not a good answer. So A, it's simple. It kind of is almost like more of a main idea, but that's kind of the point. You're either restating the main idea of what they gave you or just another sentence. All right, so this is our last question. Archaeologists have been debating the origin of a rare form of lead found in Shang Dynasty bronze artifacts since its presence was discovered in China in the 1990s. Different researchers have proposed theories on which regions of the world would have had the raw materials containing this specific lead in these artifacts, but no conclusive evidence has been presented. What is intriguing is the bronze artifacts from China dated after the Shang Dynasty do not contain this form of lead, suggesting that blank. Okay, so it's a short passage, but a lot going on here. So basically, during the Shang Dynasty, the bronze artifacts had this rare lead, and we don't really know where the raw materials that they probably used to make like the bronze artifacts, because metals don't just like exist, um, purely. We have to use raw materials, and then from there we find the bronze and the metal. So, where the raw metal that contained this lead, which we used for the bronze artifacts, we don't really know where it comes from. And after the Shang Dynasty, the bronze artifacts don't have that sort of lead. So, if I had to follow this logic that bronze had rare lead, we don't know where the lead came from, and the bronze in China doesn't have that rare lead after the Shang Dynasty, I would say simply that wherever the raw materials came from, they stopped using it. And this might seem simple because, like, yeah, duh, like the bronze doesn't have the lead anymore, so they stopped using those same raw materials. That's kind of obvious, but we really don't have any more information here. We don't know if it's because they lost access to it because it was from another country. Maybe it was from their own country. Maybe we don't know if it's just like they just found another way to extract the bronze from the raw materials. We don't know any of that. All we know is that since it doesn't have that form of lead, they found their raw material elsewhere. They found a different source for the bronze that doesn't have that lead. That's pretty much all we know. So just take a second to see which one is right and why the other ones are wrong. So here B is the best answer. So the source of some of the raw materials used to make bronze was exploited only until the end of the Shang Dynasty. So exploited just means like used. So the raw materials used to make this bronze, they used it only until the end of the Shang Dynasty, which is pretty much what they said. They just stopped using it after the Shang Dynasty. So A is wrong because the bronze pieces are rare and therefore more valuable than those from other time periods. We don't know if they're more valuable just because they have rare lead. It doesn't say that it makes them more valuable. They're definitely unique for that reason, but we don't know if they're more valuable. C, bronze was used for a short time during the Shang Dynasty before different metals were used to make artifacts. That's not true. We're saying that they always used bronze because there's still bronze artifacts dated after the Shang Dynasty. We're just saying that during the Shang Dynasty, the bronze material also had some lead in it, this rare form of lead in it. D, methods used to analyze bronze artifacts are not useful on pieces that are dated after the Shang Dynasty. This passage has nothing to do talking about which methods to analyze bronze are good or bad. It really has nothing to do with that. So D also doesn't really make a lot of sense. So B, again, simple. It's a simple conclusion to make. Like, it doesn't have it in there, so they stopped using it. That's the only conclusion you can make. So that's why B is just going to be our closest answer. The Haitian Declaration of Independence was issued in 1804, bringing to an end the revolution against colonial France that began in 1791. Written in French, which was not the first language of most Haitians, but which was used throughout Europe as a language of international diplomacy, the Declaration notes that Haiti will not bring rebellion to other Caribbean nations, promises to respect the sovereignty of its neighbors, widely understood as a reassurance to the United States, and sets up Haiti as an example for future struggles against colonizers, an implicit reference to the many colonies then found in the Americas. So, even though the declaration is explicitly addressed to the Haitian people, it's reasonable to conclude that blank. Okay, so this passage is talking about Haiti and their Declaration of Independence, right? So they had a revolution against colonial France, so now they're sort of like a free colony. They're a free state now, right? And I see like throughout the passage, they're talking about how even though it's addressed to the Haitian people, it's not in their first language, right? So even though it's addressed to them, they clearly want to address other countries in Europe because they use French in international diplomacy, right? So they also want to attract Europe's attention. And they're talking kind of directly to them. They want to say that Haiti is not going to bring rebellion to other Caribbean nations. We're not going to make them revolt against you. Especially, this is considered reassurance to the United States specifically. So they're almost talking directly to the United States, like, we're not going to bring rebellion to your own colonies. We're going to leave them alone. But we are also an example of a successful revolution. So, they're also setting themselves up as sort of powerful in this world context, right? They're speaking almost to the other colonies found in the Americas, like, we did it, you can kind of do it too. So here, even though it's addressed to the Haitian people and it's their Declaration of Independence, it's addressing other countries and empires, especially in Europe and the US, as, like a new powerful state. If it was just addressed to the Haitian people, it probably wouldn't just be in French, right? So it is reasonable to conclude that it was a message to many other nations and places as well. Again, note that since this last sentence, it needs to be something about who the declaration is addressed to, because you want to contradict the fact that it's just addressed to the Haitian people. It's also addressed to other nations and places as a message of its like new independence. So take a minute to see which one matches up best with this finishing the logic. I would say D. So the declaration actually had several intended audiences, pretty much what we said, right? So A, aspects of the declaration were modeled on similar documents from other countries. Well, I don't know. I mean, yes, it was written in French, like other European documents, probably. But we don't know if aspects of the declaration or like the structure of the declaration were modeled on similar documents. Like, we just know French is like the general language. That's not the same thing as being like modeled structurally as similar documents. So we're not sure. That's sort of a stretch, right? B, the French government may have been surprised by the declaration. Uh, well, it doesn't really talk about the French government's reaction to this Declaration of Independence. It's talking about who it's addressed to and like the contents of the Declaration of Independence. So there's nothing in here that would tell us anything about the French government's reaction. Maybe we can infer they're kind of mad because the Haitian people won the revolution and it was their colony. We don't know if they were surprised. There's not really any basis for that. C, many Haitian people oppose the revolution in the declaration. We have no idea what the Haitian people think of this declaration. That's not even mentioned anywhere. So there's no way that we can infer that. It might be true. And also, if we're just reading the sentence, like, so even though the declaration is explicitly addressed to the Haitian people, it's reasonable to conclude that many Haitian people oppose the revolution in the declaration. Yes, this part is still about the Haitian people, but this passage as a whole is not about the Haitian people. It's about other people who the Declaration of Independence is addressed to. So this one doesn't really make a lot of sense either. D is the only one that actually matches up the logic. Again, think of that. It was almost like we found out the main idea, and now we're just stating it in that last sentence. So you can kind of see that we're using similar strategies as main idea questions. Okay, so this is our next one. Songbirds learn to respond to and imitate their species song from an early age. With each generation, small differences are introduced that result in distinct variation, called dialects, among geographically isolated populations of the same species. Okay, just to recap that. So these songbirds, they kind of learn to how to imitate their song from an early age. And then as time goes on, there are like more little variations in the language, which are called like dialects. So like kind of different sorts of languages. Same language, just like small differences in different parts of the world. So different communities will have like a different dialect. A researcher's study examined whether 12-day-old whatever nestlings prefer local dialects over the unfamiliar dialects of non-local bird populations. The more begging calls the nestlings made in response to a song, the stronger their preference. So they're doing an experiment to see if they like their local songs more or foreign songs more. The researchers found that the nestlings produced more begging calls in response to their own dialect than to non-local dialects. Since song preference plays a role in songbird mate selection, the findings suggest that blank. Okay, so basically, these songbirds, I'm not going to read out the word, songbirds, because they have different dialects, the researchers want to know if a dialect in one sort of neighborhood um, likes like local songs, or maybe they like songs from other places better. And so, because they make more begging calls in response to their own dialect, that means they like their own dialect more, because here it says the more begging calls, the stronger their preference. So they prefer their own dialect. Now, this one is kind of weird because it just kind of throws in mate selection. It doesn't really talk about it here. But it does say since song preference plays a role in like choosing your mate, which means like they listen to a potential mate's song to see if they like them or not. If I go according to the logic, that probably means that they choose their mates based on how much they like their song. And if they like local songs more than foreign songs, foreign dialects, they probably choose mates from their local area over other places. So again, a long sort of science passage, but if you break it down, it just basically say it's like they like their local songs more, so they're gonna usually choose a local mate because they kind of choose mates based on how much they like their songs. Okay, so if take a second to read these sort of long answers and see which one matches up the best. So C pretty much says what I said in wordier ways. So the nestlings' preference for their own dialect likely drives them when they mature to reproduce or like mate with other of their species from local rather than non-local populations. All it's saying like their dialect or song, here it's used interchangeably like the language. They want to mature once they reproduce. They want to reproduce once they mature with local birds of their own species. So let's walk through the other ones, why they're wrong. So A, their preference for their own dialect likely disappears as they mature. We have no idea of that. We know is that they prefer their own songs. There's no proof that it goes away as they go older. So that doesn't really make any sense. Nestlings who show an early preference for their own dialect are likely to receive more food from their caretakers. Maybe that's true, but it does not talk about caretakers anywhere. And this sentence is about mate selection. So our answer choice also has to do something about choosing a mate, not how much food they receive like from their parents. Like that's an unrelated thing, right? So that's also incorrect. And then D, these specific nestlings show a preference for both local of their species dialects and songs of other local songbirds over the songs of non-local birds of any species. So this one might be a little confusing, but essentially they're not this passage is talking about how they react to songs of their own species, but this one is talking about other local songbirds and like birds of any species. We don't know anything about birds of any species. It doesn't mention anything about mate selection, which is already red flag, but also we don't know anything about other songbird species and their song and how much these specific like pied flycatchers like it. So that's why C is the most relevant answer. It follows the logic and makes the most sense. All right, so it's common for jazz musicians and fans to refer to certain songs as having swing, indicating that the songs provoke a strong feeling, like the impulse to tap one's foot or dance. The exact acoustic properties that give a song swing, however, have long thought to be undefinable. Okay, so certain songs have these acoustic properties that kind of make it feel swingier, kind of make you want to dance or tap your foot. But for a long time, we just think that we can't exactly define what parts of the song give a song swing. To investigate swing, a team led by physicist Corentin Nelius delayed the downbeats and synchronized the offbeats in jazz piano solos, and asked jazz musicians to compare the intensity of swing in each modified piece with the intensity of swing in the original piece. Okay, so they're just kind of explaining what they're doing in this experiment. And you don't have to understand what they mean exactly by delaying downbeats and synchronizing offbeats in these piano solos. You just need to understand we're doing something with these things called downbeats and offbeats, right? You don't have to understand exactly what that means. We're just manipulating these elements of a song, I'm guessing, and we're seeing if this changes the swing in the piece after you do these changes. They found that the participants were more than 7 times likelier to characterize the modified songs as having swing than to characterize the original versions as having swing, suggesting that blank. Okay, so what's the result of this experiment? After they changed that stuff with the downbeats and offbeats, participants found the changed versions had a lot more swing than the original versions after we changed this stuff. So if I'm just kind of going along with the logic of this text, certain sound properties make jazz have more swing, but again, we're not sure what they are. And then after we changed the downbeats and upbeats in the solos, the changed versions had more swing. I think the most logical conclusion to make, again, that's not explicitly said in the text, but we can kind of pretty much state, is that downbeats and upbeats affect the swing of a song, or how the downbeats and upbeats are in a song might give the song more swing or maybe less swing, whatever. Again, you don't have to understand what downbeats and upbeats mean. You don't need to understand what we did with them. You just need to understand that we changed these things and they brought more swing to a song. So again, the easiest way to finish this logic is that these things affect the swing of a song. So take a second to see which answer choice matches up with that logic. So I think D does that pretty much exactly what we said. The timing of downbeats and offbeats may play a crucial role in giving a song swing. If you were able to understand it a little bit, when we say delaying, we're just saying where the downbeats come a little later than they did originally. And I'm not totally sure what synchronizing offbeats means, but we're kind of changing when the downbeats come in and when the offbeats happen. So that's kind of what we mean by the timing, but you don't need to understand that this whatever of downbeats and offbeats play a crucial or important role in the swing of a song. So let's see why the other choices are a little off. So A, synchronized offbeats tend to give a song swing regardless of whether downbeats are delayed. Okay, well, it's a little confusing because yes, synchronized offbeats do give a song swing, but regardless of whether the downbeats are delayed, that's something that we can't say because this experiment changed both at the same time. We didn't change just this and then didn't change just the downbeats and see if those individual changes had like different effects. We changed both of these at the same time. So it's impossible to say if one of them is doing all the work and the other one doesn't matter because we tested both of these changes at the same time. Maybe if we did an experiment where we kept the downbeats the same as they originally were and just changed the offbeats and it did give more swing to the song, then we could say, okay, yes, the offbeats are all we need to change to give more swing. But in this experiment, we're changing both at the same time. So we can't just say only changing or synchronizing the offbeats is giving the song swing. So that's just not something that we can back up with this experiment. B, the acoustic properties that give a song swing are not easy for jazz musicians to manipulate. Well, we just kind of did that, right? The musicians did just manipulate these elements, and we were able to find out a lot about what gives a song swing. So this is kind of a negative answer that it's just not easy for jazz musicians to manipulate acoustic properties, but we just kind of figured stuff about that out. We kind of figured out that offbeats and offbeats and downbeats are important acoustic properties that we can manipulate to give a song more swing. So this is kind of pointing us in the opposite direction. We did find a way to manipulate them. So our overall concluding logic shouldn't be that it's not easy for them to manipulate. Now we know ways that we can manipulate acoustic properties to give a song more swing. So this is sort of a negative answer that the passage is not really pointing to. And then C, jazz songs that feature the piano are more likely to have swing than are jazz songs that do not feature the piano. So if you read carefully, it looks like we're just changing songs that have jazz piano solos. So everything we're changing, we're doing with jazz piano solos. So probably all the music that we're using in this experiment has piano in it. There are no songs that we're dealing with that do not feature piano. So we can't say anything about songs that don't feature the piano because all of the songs in this experiment do have the piano with the piano solo. So again, C, it's just not supported. We can't say anything about piano versus not piano. So that leaves D as our simplest and most direct answer. So again, you just kind of had to not understand every single word. As long as you got the general idea that we're changing these two things, and hopefully you are able to understand what swing means in this context, D should be a easier conclusion to reach after all this. All right, so let's read this one out loud. Many animals, including humans, must sleep, and sleep is known to have a role in everything from healing injuries to encoding information in long-term memory. So a lot of benefits. But sometimes scientists claim that, from an evolutionary standpoint, deep sleep for hours at a time leaves an animal so vulnerable that the known benefits of sleeping seem insufficient to explain why it became so widespread in the animal kingdom. So animals sleep a lot, but it leaves them at risk because they're sleeping for so long that the benefits don't really outweigh the risk. So these scientists therefore imply that blank. Okay, so it's a short passage, but let's still break it down. So basically, they're saying we know that sleep has like a lot of known benefits, and animals do sleep for long periods of time, but it leaves them at risk. And basically, these scientists are claiming that the benefits that we already know, they don't outweigh the risk. So they're kind of confused why it's more beneficial to sleep for longer, even though the risk outweighs the known benefits, right? So if I have to follow this logic that sleep has benefits or known benefits, but sleep leaves animals vulnerable and the known benefits are not good enough to explain this, I think they're just implying that there are more useful benefits to sleep that we just don't know yet, which would explain why it became so widespread in animals, because the benefits that we don't know probably outweigh the risk of being vulnerable for so many hours. Okay, so let's see which answer which matches up best with this logic. I think it's A. So prolonged deep sleep is likely advantageous in ways that have yet to be discovered. I think that's pretty much what we said, that advantageous means like it has advantages that we don't know yet that probably outweigh the risk of being vulnerable for so long. Now, the thing that makes this question a little tricky is more the answer choices, I think. So, B, most traits perform functions that are hard to understand from an evolutionary standpoint. That is true about sleep, definitely. We are saying that from an evolutionary standpoint, they use that wording up here in the passage itself. It's kind of hard to understand why it's so common. But we only know this about sleep. We don't know this about most traits, like in general. So this is true for sleep, but we don't know if it's true about most traits. So that's why this one is incorrect. C, it is more important to understand how widespread prolonged deep sleep is than to understand its function. This is basically saying it's not important to understand its function, but this entire passage is talking about how we kind of want to understand the additional functions to sleep. So this is kind of the opposite of what the researchers want to do. Many traits that provide significant benefits for an animal also likely pose risks to that animal. Again, this second part is fine. We are saying that sleep has benefits, but it also has a pretty big risk that it leaves them so vulnerable. So that is kind of true about sleep. But again, see many traits. Again, we only know that about sleep. Okay, we don't know of that about any other animal traits. So again, that's why B and D, the second part or most of it is kind of correct, but it's the most traits or many traits that make it an incorrect answer. So that's why A is going to be the best answer. That just kind of neatly finishes up our logic. All right, so this one is definitely trickier than the one before, so let's just take it slowly. One theory behind human bipedalism speculates that it originated in a mostly ground-based ancestor that practiced four-legged knuckle walking, like chimpanzees and gorillas do today, and eventually evolved into moving upright on two legs. So, even if you're not sure what bipedalism means, you can kind of look at the root of the word. So, bi means two, something that has like ped has something to do with feet. So, something about 2 feet, or here it kind of gives it to you moving upright on two legs. That's what we mean by bipedalism, just kind of walking on your two legs. So, it's saying that um, chimpanzees and gorillas, they kind of probably walked on the ground, or something with on their like four knuckles, and eventually just kind of started standing on two. But recently, researchers observed orangutans, another relative of humans, standing on two legs on tree branches and using their arms for balance when they reach for fruits. These observations may suggest that blank. Okay, so the second part is saying that even though we think that bipedalism originated mostly in like ground-based ancestors, so when you say ground-based ancestors, that means like chimpanzees and gorillas kind of mostly stayed on the floor on their four knuckles, right? But here we're talking about orangutans, and it looks like if they're standing on two legs or being bipedal on tree branches and using their arms for reaching fruits, they're basically like climbing the tree, right? So these are tree dwelling ancestors. They live in the trees, which makes them a little different than chimpanzees and gorillas. And they are also using their 2 feet like humans do today. So, because I think this is kind of adding on to this original theory. So, scientists think that walking evolved from ancestors who moved on all four knuckles on the floor, but we're saying that orangutans use bipedalism to help them get fruits while climbing trees. So, if this whole passage is kind of about how human bipedalism evolved, then I would say that the bipedalism may have evolved because it made it easier to climb trees for certain human ancestors that probably lived in the trees. So I think this one's a little tricky because there are a lot of things just kind of being named here. But I think all it's saying is that, I think bipedalism may have also evolved because certain ancestors lived in the trees, and being able to stand on two legs in the branches probably made it easier to get fruit, like for the orangutans. So it's a little different than just what we thought before. I think this one is helpful to come up with your own logic first, because as we'll see, you can kind of get pretty confused by these answer choices. So take a second and see which one matches up best with this logic. So I think A here. Bipedalism evolved because it was advantageous to a tree-dwelling ancestor of humans, in this case orangutans. I think that's what we're saying, because it helped these orangutans climb trees, that it kind of evolved to be in humans as well. Now let's look at the other answer choices. So bipedalism must have evolved simultaneously with knuckle walking and tree climbing. Okay, well, it is talking about how bipedalism evolved, which is good. But this means that bipedalism, knuckle walking, and tree climbing all evolved like at the same time alongside with each other. But this is wrong, because I think this first part is saying at first not people, at first, these gorillas, walked with knuckle walking on four legs. And then after that, bipedalism evolved. So it was knuckle walking and then bipedalism, or tree climbing and then bipedalism. So not all three of these things happened at the very same time. And I don't think the point of the passage is talking about when bipedalism evolved. It's talking from what bipedalism evolved. So that's why B isn't a good answer. Okay, so C, moving between the ground and the trees would have been difficult without bipedalism. Well, this one is kind of tempting because this is implying that bipedalism made it easier to move in the trees. But we're not technically talking about moving between the ground and the trees. So kind of going from the ground to the trees and the trees to the ground. That's not necessarily what we're talking about, I don't think. To me, it sounds like we're just talking about like once you're in the tree, like once you're in there, like how you're moving in the tree. That's probably where bipedalism helps you. But we don't know if moving between the ground and the trees would have been difficult without bipedalism. That's not necessarily what it's talking about. It's just not as relevant to me as A, because it's not even talking about, it's not directly referencing the evolution of bipedalism like A and B are kind of doing. So for those reasons, while C is a little confusing because like, yeah, it is talking about how bipedalism makes moving in the trees easier. I'm not sure if they mean moving between the ground and the trees. So I'm just not a really big fan of that answer choice. It's a little confusing for me. D, a knuckle walking human ancestor could have easily moved bipedally in trees. Well, we don't actually know that because there's nothing about, we don't know if orangutans were knuckle walkers, and we don't know if a knuckle walking human ancestor could have just like easily become like bipedal like once they get in the trees. That's not really what it's talking about. We're just talking about these ancestors just were kind of could move bipedally in the trees, and that's why humans kind of evolved to walk bipedally from them. We're not talking if knuckle walkers themselves could become bipedal themselves in the tree. So that's kind of off topic. The topic is that how bipedalism evolved in humans and where that came from. And A does that best. It's bipedalism evolved because it was advantageous to a tree-dwelling ancestor of humans. That's the most obvious and logical conclusion. I think all of these are a little complicated and just not simply as direct as A. So that's why A is going to be your best answer. All right, so this one is also a little tricky because it's so long, but again, we're just going to take it slowly and break it down. So these people in their Mediterranean Sea biodiversity census reported approximately 17,000 species, nearly double the number reported in Carl LeBlanc and Carl Maury's 2000 census, a difference only partly attributable to the description of new invertebrate species in the interim. Okay, so basically there are these two separate studies on biodiversity in the Mediterranean, and one study found way more species than the other. And while they did find new invertebrate species somewhere, I don't really know what they mean on the interim, it's only partly attributable. So that means like even though they found new invertebrate species, that's not enough to explain this giant gap, right? Another factor is that the morphological variability of microorganisms is poorly understood compared to that of vertebrates, invertebrates, plants, and algae, creating uncertainty about how to evaluate microorganisms as species. Okay, so I'm going to have a really big word here, but that's okay. You don't need to understand exactly what it means. Because we're talking about classifying species and stuff, and we're saying it's hard to evaluate microorganisms as species, and we're talking about variability, and morphological kind of means I'm thinking sort of like kind of morphing something into something new. So I think this is talking about like how microorganisms can, obviously be different from one another, but these differences are poorly understood. So this makes it a little hard for researchers to know when to classify certain organisms as species because they don't know if they're so different that they're different species or similar enough, even though if they have a little bit of difference, that we can say that they're the same species. So they're just not sure when to classify a group of microorganisms as species and when to not. Researchers' decisions on such matters, therefore, can be highly consequential or really important. Indeed, the two consensuses reported similar counts of vertebrate, plant, and algal species, suggesting that blank. Okay, so again, a long, very sciencey passage, but what are we talking about? We're talking about these microorganisms have something to do with finding so many more species in the 2010 census, okay, by Cole and these people. And again, we see indeed, so whatever comes after the blank is just going to be supporting something that we already said. So I think we're just supporting the fact that microorganisms, they both studies kind of approached classifying microorganisms as species kind of differently. So because Cole found way more species in the study, and it's hard to know when to classify them as species, I'm thinking that Cole probably was very particular about when to. Cole probably saw small differences in the population and was like, okay, this is a new species. So, to illustrate what I'm saying here, is that let's say both of these researchers, these groups of researchers, found this out in the sea. Bianca and Carla Mori probably looked at this and saw, okay, well, they're all purple, so let's just count all of these as one species. But Marta Cole and her colleagues probably saw this and were like, okay, yeah, they're all purple, but they're all have a different shape. So I'm going to say this is 3 different species. So they didn't necessarily find anything new. They're just kind of more particular about like any small difference is going to be a new species, which is probably why they found so many more species than the earlier study. So if I had to finish the logic, I'd just say Cole considered even the smallest differences in microorganisms as a different species, making the amount of species documented much higher than the other study. Again, looking at this example, Bianchi and Mori would look at this and just say 1 species. Cole would look at this and say 3 species, which is why even though they did find new invertebrate species, which may have increased the number a little bit, it's mainly this difference in classification of microorganism species that resulted in such different numbers. So again, these answer twists are kind of long, but take a second and read through them and see which one matches the best with this logic. Okay, so some differences, I think B is the best one. So some differences observed in microorganisms may have been treated as variations within species by Bianchi and Mori, so just a little different but the same species by the first study, but treated as an indicative of a distinct species by Cole and colleagues. Basically, all this is saying is that Bianchi and Mori treated small differences like variations within the same species, but they treated little differences as indicative or a sign of a new distinct species, which makes their number a lot higher. Okay, so let's walk through the other answer choices. Cole and colleagues reported a much higher number of species than Bianchi and Mori did, largely due to the inclusion of invertebrate species that had not been described in the earlier study. Well, they already kind of said pretty obviously that that's not the main reason. It's only partly attributable to the new invertebrate species, but the main factor is the microorganisms, not the new invertebrate species that they found. Answer C. The first study may have been less sensitive to the degree of morphological variation displayed within a typical species of microorganism than Cole and colleagues were. Okay, so this is also incorrect because if they were less sensitive to degree of variation within a species, this is kind of the opposite. They were very sensitive, or they cared a lot about the fact that even in one species there can be variation. So they were kind of thinking about that. They were very sensitive to the fact that, okay, even though there are small variations, that can still be within a typical species. So they were very careful to not classify anything as a new species. They're very sensitive to the fact that even just because you have some variation, that doesn't mean it's a different species. You can still have this same typical species and have small variations. So they were actually more sensitive to it than Cole and colleagues were. Cole and colleagues didn't really seem to care much about the fact of like how, variations can actually maybe be more similar to each other than different. They weren't very sensitive to that fact. They were just kind of like, okay, difference, new species. So they were less sensitive to the fact that even within a typical species, you can have small variations while having more similarities than differences. So Bianchi and Moore were actually more sensitive to variation within one species. D, the absence of clarity regarding how to differentiate among species of microorganisms may have resulted in Cole and colleagues underestimating the number of microorganism species. Well, this is the opposite. The coal, again, that's the new study. So the new study didn't underestimate the microorganism species. I think they more overestimated it, because underestimating means they probably found less microorganism species than the original census, but they found a lot more, right? So maybe they were sort of overestimating the number of microorganism species. But it is true that there is an absence of clarity to how to differentiate among species of organisms, but they actually overestimated it because of this, not underestimated. So while this one is a little bit complicated, very wordy, again, just kind of the main idea here is sort of that because microorganisms are hard to classify, Cole just kind of looked at any sort of difference and called it a new species, while Bianchi and Carly were a little more sensitive to the fact that you can still have some differences while being of the same species. So that's why B is going to be our best answer. Again, you can kind of use this transition to help you. If you have just indeed, that means you're just kind of restating something else, or kind of restating the main idea of what you already have in a neater way. Okay, so this is our last one. Researchers blah 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 modeled varying levels of passenger redistribution from short haul flights, flights of 50 to 210 minutes from takeoff to landing, to high speed rail trips. So I'm not entirely sure what they mean by passenger redistribution, but I do know we're talking about like shorter flights and high speed rail trips or train trips. So planes travel faster than trains, but air travel typically requires 3 hours of lead time for security, baggage handling, and boarding that rail travel doesn't. So short haul routes take similar amounts of time by air and by rail. So basically, they're saying even though planes are faster than trains, the time that you have to take before you get on the plane makes the whole process just as long. So they kind of even out for short haul flights or short haul routes. However, the model suggests that as rail passenger volumes approach current capacity limits, long lead times emerge. Therefore, for rail to remain a viable alternative to short haul flights, blank. Okay, so basically they're saying that when the train starts filling up and the volumes are kind of approaching like the maximum amount of people you can take on like one train, that long lead time for the plane, it becomes pretty long for the train as well. So I'm guessing that at that point, the whole train process probably becomes slower or longer than the whole plane process when you start approaching current capacity limits. And then people aren't really going to want to take the plane. They're not going to want to take the train, they're going to want to take the plane. So you kind of have to figure out what should the railway do to make sure that people still choose them. So it looks like the main problem they're pointing towards is the fact that the trains fill up really fast. So there's a problem with the current capacity limit. And if they were able to take more people on the same route, that would mean people would still choose trains. So I'm guessing the rail system needs to accommodate more passengers somehow for the same route as a plane route. And this is going to this is going to slow down it's going to make the process not as slow, and people are going to want to choose the rail system. So it's a little confusing in the beginning, but if you kind of just think about it, we're just figuring out how to accommodate more people so that the train is a better alternative. Okay, so none of these answer choices you'll notice is exactly this logic, but just sort of think about which best matches up with our sort of guess. So I think B here is our best guess. So rail systems may need to schedule additional trains for these routes, because the more trains you have for kind of the same route, again for these routes, like additional trains for that same route, the more people you're able to take on one trip to A to B, right? So you've kind of solved the problem. Now you can take more people on multiple trains. So now you're going to kind of lose that long lead time. A, rail systems should offer fewer long-haul routes and airlines should offer more long-haul routes. We're not talking about long-haul routes. This passage is about short-haul routes. We don't know anything about long-haul routes or sort of just like longer travels. So we can't really say anything about long-haul routes. Also, it doesn't really make sense because the railway system can't make the airlines do anything. I think this is just talking about what can the railway do to still be a good alternative. They can't control the airline. They can't tell them to do whatever this is. So this doesn't really make a lot of sense. C, security, baggage handling, and boarding procedures used by airlines may need to be implemented for rail systems. Well, no, because we're saying all these things is what makes the lead time for planes so long. So if we put them for rail systems, that's probably just going to make the entire process a lot slower, right? So that doesn't make any sense. D, passengers who travel by rail for these routes will need to accept that lead times will be similar to those for air travel. Well, that's kind of weird. Like you're just telling the passengers to get used to it. That doesn't really make any sense. Also, I think the problem here is that the lead time is going to end up being a little longer for trains than for air travel because if they're already the same, and once you're approaching current capacity limits, the long lead times come out, it's probably going to overall be slower than a plane trip. So asking passengers just to suck it up is probably not going to be the best choice to remain a good alternative. So that's why B, adding more trains so that you can have more capacity for the same route is probably going to solve the railways problems. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful going all of those inference questions. Again, I'm just showing the strategies up on the screen. Again, just make sure that before you go to the answer choices, because especially here they can be really confusing. You can kind of make anything fit if you think about it enough. So make sure you're kind of at least forming your own opinion, at least about the direction that the inference should go. Again, looking at what the claim is, what is the main idea of everything you already have, just kind of write out that logic in your head. What should be the next logical step? Again, don't overthink it. Don't get distracted by overly confusing answers. Some questions obviously have more confusing answer choices than others where you do need to think about it, but just choose the one that fits the most naturally. Don't try to make anything fit if it really doesn't fit. So yeah, hopefully this was helpful, and I will see you in the next video.